When I'm asked what I think is probably the best diet for someone who's more predisposed to diabetes, maybe they already have some degree of insulin resistance or they have prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, should it be a low-carb diet, a low-carb ketogenic diet where you're eating very little carbohydrate and in a state of ketosis most of the time? Or should it be a diet that's maybe the other way around where it's a diet much higher in carbohydrates? Well, one of the more interesting studies to point out that is often ignored by people on both sides is a diet known as the DIETFITS studies. You can look it up. It was published in JAMA. It was a study conducted out of Stanford University. And the interesting thing to start with is, when I look at a study to discern whether it's a study that is objective or not, I look at the authors of the paper and I look at where did the funding come from. And this is an interesting study because that was a study that had participants, you can say, on both sides of the camp. There were people that were very much proponents of the low-carb ketogenic diet on one side, and in fact, a majority of the funding outside of the government came from an organization that was really an organization there to promote the low-carb ketogenic diet. There's actually some fairly major funders of low-carb ketogenic diet studies, and it was a largely funded by that study as well as some NIH funding on the other side. It was a study done at Stanford, and what they did was this, that they allowed the people who were in favor of a low carbohydrate ketogenic diet to design the study they thought was really the healthiest version of that diet that they could think of, that they would say, the ideal low-carb ketogenic diet. And then on the other side, they allowed the people that believed that the best diet was, no, it was the other way around. It was a high carbohydrate, lower fat diet, kind of a Dean Ornish diet, if you will, a diet that's closer to a, you might say plant-forward or vegetarian diet or even vegan in some sense. So they allowed those people to design their study or their diet. And then what they did was they took 800 people and they randomly assigned them to one diet or another. So they either were assigned to be on the low-carb ketogenic diet or the low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet, but both diets were considered to be optimal. So it meant that, number one, everybody was on real food. They were eating real food. And so that kind of leveled the playing field in the sense that a lot of the low-carb ketogenic studies compare the low-carb ketogenic diet to a diet that's low-fat but a lot of processed foods, processed carbohydrates. That wasn't in this study. And in fact, they actually gave the people the food to take home. So it was an expensive study. They provided all the food for people. And the most important thing to this study was that in these 800 people, they randomized them to either diet. And before they randomized them, they actually did a number of tests on these people. They did genetic tests on them to see which of these people had genetic markers that made them more likely to have diabetes or insulin resistance. So they did genetic testing on people. They also did some clinical tests on people, like a glucose tolerance test where they measured the response to a glucose load, and they measured the insulin response to the meal and their fasting insulin levels. So they found out which of those people through these clinical tests had already some degree of insulin resistance or prediabetes. I don't think they allowed people with type 2 diabetes in the study, but they looked for people that were really heading the way of the type 2 diabetes. And so in the background, they were able to say, amongst these people were a collection of people that had a very high likelihood that they would respond better to a low-carb ketogenic diet because they were already insulin resistant. So they figured, that the likelihood is that people who have any degree of insulin resistance, maybe anybody with obesity, anybody who has elevated fasting insulin levels or showed some elevated glucose after the glucose tolerance test, or maybe an elevated A1C, these were the people that would benefit from a low-carb ketogenic diet. That was the hypothesis, and most people probably thought that's the way it would turn out. Well, lo and behold, at the end of about a year, when they unblinded the study and they figured out, that of course, everybody knew which diet they were on. They knew they were on a low-fat diet, high carbohydrate. They knew they were on a low-carb ketogenic diet, but they didn't know what their blood tests were going to show. So they unblinded that, and then they looked at the data, and lo and behold, they found there was absolutely zero difference between the outcomes, in the sense that The amount of weight loss was similar in both groups. And again, it was a whole foods, healthy version of a high carbohydrate, high fiber, probably low glycemic index, relatively low fat diet versus a low carb ketogenic diet with a lot of vegetables. It wasn't a carnivore diet. Back then, there wasn't that many people that were believing in the carnivore diet as there are now. So it was actually what they used to think was the healthy version of a ketogenic diet. So whole foods, and it wasn't processed meats and things like that. And they were eating a lot of vegetables, non-starchy vegetables. But when they compared the two groups, identical outcomes essentially. Their blood tests looked better, but both groups looked equally good. Their cardiovascular risk factors improved. Their glycemic responses improved, and so on. And here's the interesting thing, that the people that were predisposed genetically to type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance, they did just as well on the high carbohydrate diet, just as well. No benefit to them being on a low carb ketogenic diet at all. 800 people, randomized controlled trial. And again, on the other side, the people that were on the low-carb ketogenic diet did well also. What's the takeaway there? Well, my primary takeaway there is that the most important thing, if you want to talk about what's the ideal diet, is stop eating from the industrialized food supply. Make food from scratch at home from real food ingredients, and you're going to probably do pretty well, almost no matter what way you cut it. Stop eating processed foods. The worst processed foods are actually foods that are often liberally eaten on a low-carb ketogenic diet by most people. Most people on a low-carb ketogenic diet are going to regularly eat processed meats, which are probably the worst of the processed foods. They're worse than the crackers and French fries and things on the high-carb unhealthy food list as well. So the bottom line is most people are eating from both sides of that unhealthy equation. They're eating from the industrialized food supply. And the main thing is start eating real food, and you're probably going to be a lot healthier for it.